or the backdrop of is always the introduction. Exodus 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. What was going on back in Egypt, back in slavery? Pharaoh, king of Egypt, was murdering all the Israelite children. You are not to be like the other nations. You shall not murder. Older translations say, you shall not kill. So does that mean we're not to kill animals or trees or anything like that? Well, the Hebrew word that translates either murder or kill in this context is the intentional, illegal taking of another human being's life. Now, it's not that God doesn't care for the other creatures. We've already seen in the fourth commandment how the commandment to rest was also to include to allow your animals, working animals presumably, to rest also. And we'll see a little later on that God does have great care for all of his creation, but he considers the taking of a human life to be on a totally different plane altogether than any other creature. Why? Well, I think you know the answer to that. Human beings are the only creatures made in the image of God. We also know there's a distinction made in the commandment between murder and accidental or manslaughter. We did that overview in Deuteronomy where Moses breaks down and applies each of the commandments in a far more wider ranging application. And when he comes to the sixth commandment, you shall not murder, he starts off with cities of refuge. Deuteronomy chapter 19. What's a city of refuge? Remember, it's a place where someone who's accused of murder or has killed someone, but it's questionable, it's disputed, and this person can go to stay in this city of refuge until they can get a fair trial so that it's properly determined by 2 or 3 witnesses, as the requirement was, they're convicted of murder. So manslaughter or accidents are different than the willful taking, illegal taking of a human life. You might have thought the sixth commandment would be the most straightforward, especially in our society, our Western 21st century developed civilized nation. Everybody agrees, don't they? You shall not murder. I mean, it's pretty agreed, not like those barbaric past cultures or foreign terrorists or war-torn places. We don't need God telling us, you shall not murder. I never killed anybody. You've all heard people say that. Everyone agrees on that, don't they? Well, it seems that they don't in the Western world. We're already, whether it's at the beginning of life or at the end of life, we're still not all in agreement on this issue. Right now, and with the issue of abortion, more lives being lost than ever before, and our secular society, that is, God's not in the picture, is very confused. If you deliberately harm a pregnant woman and kill the baby within it, you can be charged with murder. But if you do it by medical means, it's legal. Very confused. And of course our state means you can kill a baby right up before it's born. And a moment later it would be illegal to kill that baby. Totally confused. We're confused even when a baby is a baby. We're confused in a lot of ways, and the opinions are varied and heated. As we've let God go out of the picture, we can't even agree on when a human being is a human being. In fact, when you remove God from the picture, the confusion goes even deeper. Our own expert in academia, Professor Peter Singer, who was now at the Princeton University in the United States and this great academic on ethics, and formerly at Monash University. Even my wife was lectured by Peter Singer. It's her claim to fame. Peter Singer says what? Let's have a look at what Professor Peter Singer's. Once the religious mumbo-jumbo surrounding the term human has been stripped away, we will not regard as sacrosanct the life of every member of our species, no matter how limited its capacity for intelligent or even conscious life may be. So get this mumbo-jumbo of God out of the picture, and we don't have to worry about, anything special about a human life. And especially if they have intelligence or physical incapacity or whatever. And of course, you don't have any moral basis for taking another human life or not. If Professor Singer's right, if there's no God in the picture, in fact, Singer goes a little bit further than killing unwanted babies before they're born. He wants to be able to kill them after they're born if both parents agree, that there's a deformity or something and we don't want that child, then we should be allowed to kill the babies after they're born. Now, we might say, that sounds terrible, but who are you to say he's wrong? Unless there is a God who says, you shall not murder another human life. That's the only basis we have for right and wrong. Otherwise, it's everybody's opinion. And hasn't Professor Singer, he's smarter than me, hasn't he got a right to an opinion? But also, if we don't have God revealing when a human becomes a human, it's also guesswork as well. Well, he answers that for us as well. Let's look at Psalm 139, verse 13. A prayer to God. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. That's when life starts. That's when a human is a human, according to God. Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So it's God who forms us in the womb. Life begins there, and we're not to take human life. The ironic thing is that science is catching up with God on this, because a few decades ago, it was sort of considered, well, it's not really a formed human yet. And now, of course, with all the ultrasounds and everything else, we can see clearly, even from early stages, there's a little baby there. There's a human being, a little life. So, pro-choice is not really asking for someone just to have their own choice. It's asking to have a choice to take another human being's life. And yes, a woman has her rights to her own body, but if they're pregnant, then inside that body is another human being. Another human being. A separate human with their own DNA, who is not the mother. And what about the right of women's rights to be born? What about the females in the womb, and males as well, for that matter? That do they have rights to live? Now, as soon as we get on to this issue, there's a couple of objections come up straight away. What happens if the mother's life is in danger? That's always the one of two things that come up in response to this whole issue. Well, to be honest with you, I don't know anyone, Christian or otherwise, has ever said you shouldn't spare a mother's life first. It's really not an argument at all on any side of the debate. But the other one that's far more sensitive and difficult is, what about when a woman has been raped? Should that be an exception? And that's a far more difficult one to look at. It's a fair question, but the first thing we should note is that it's only around 1% of abortions are actually involved because of conception through rape, and less than 1% are where the mother's life's in danger. So right up front, let's actually just get the facts out here, the argument is really about the other 98% of abortions. In fact, to make those couple of issues as if that's the whole abortion argument is sort of, well, at best it's misleading, worse it's downright dishonest. What about the 98%? There's an American pro-life politician I was listening to saying, I'd be willing to negotiate about the rape cases if we could just stop the slaughter of the other 99%. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but the point he was making was, let's actually get on to the real discussion here and not forget this smokescreen that comes and ignore the 99% in the debate. Now, that doesn't make this whole thing of a rape victim an easy one. That's still a very traumatic, very difficult thing for and especially if it's a younger girl. But the question is even the grievous sin of rape the fault of the unborn child? We've looked at in this series how God does not punish the children for the sin of the fathers. We've looked at Ezekiel 18. We've looked at Deuteronomy 24. God does not punish children. Children are not to be punished for the sin of the father. And how does it help if one victim takes it out on another? I remember I mentioned to you once, just after the March for the Babies, that one of the speakers was a lady whose testimony was that she had been conceived by rape, and her mother chose to go ahead and have her, and she's since come to know Jesus, and she just kept repeating, I'm so thankful to be alive. I have life. I'm so thankful that I'm alive today. If you're into surfing or you're a sports fan, you'd know the name Lane Beachley. She was the Australian 7-time world champion, surf champion, only person, male or female, to ever win 6 world championships in a row. And so when you're looking at this discussion, abortion for rape victims, well, you've just murdered Lane Beachley, because that's how she was born. She was conceived. Now, it's not that just because someone's famous or successful or that they're worth sparing, but it personalises the fact that these are real people. They're human beings. And killing any life is a precious thing. Every life is precious. And as Christians, we've got an even more profound belief in all of this, because we believe that there is no human being who's ever come into this world by chance. That God sovereignly forms each and every individual in the womb. Zechariah 12:1. Every individual he forms them in the womb, in their very soul from the very beginning, individually precious to God, each life, including those conceived by rape. If you really think about the sovereignty of God in this fallen world and the way people, through sin, things happen, have a look at the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. And you see there, yes, we know through the Holy Spirit, Luke chapter 1 verse 35, the Holy Spirit overwhelms Mary so that her sin is not passed on to him. But his human genealogy includes incest, prostitution, Rahab. God used that line to produce the Messiah. In other words, God is over all these, even the sin of men, where men have sinned. And when we show real compassion to a rape victim, you can actually start to point them to the wonder of this child in you has actually been planned by God. By God, even through just as you could explain to them how Herod and Pontius Pilate conspired together to do evil, all they did was what God planned beforehand. And so every child planned by God. And we can point people to start to appreciate the value of the child in and of itself, not just because of sin that might have been committed by the father. And of course, there's the option of adoption too in these situations. There are plenty of people who would love to adopt children, and adoption, we got something more to say about adoption than just the average person. Adoption is an amazing, profound biblical concept. You wouldn't be here knowing God today if it wasn't for adoption. It's one of the great theological truths of salvation, that God adopts us. So every human life is precious, made in the image of God. So have you been listening to that, children? Why are human beings even more important than your most loved pets and so on? Why are human beings more important? Do you know why? It's because we're made in the image of God. And that means something very special. It doesn't mean we look like God. It means we're able to have a personal relationship with God like no other creature. It means that we can carry out his image and build things, create things, and do all kinds of things that other creatures can't. We can reason, we can love, we can have relationships, we can communicate like no other creatures. So Professor Peter Singer is particularly out to eliminate either at the beginning of life or the end of life, anyone who's not measuring up to his standard. As long as everybody agrees, let's get rid of them. And that's fine if you don't have an eternal perspective. If you don't believe we're made in the image of God and you don't have the eternal perspective. Singer looks at, someone who's got a mental disability or a severe physical disability. Oh, they're no good. Let's get rid of them. I don't know about you, but I've been in churches where I've seen people with profound mental disability praising Jesus with all their heart. Not much else they can communicate, but they know Jesus. In the eternal perspective, whose shoes would you rather be in? That person with a mental disability who knows Jesus, or Professor Singer's great academics who don't know God, who are going to hurtle into eternity without Christ? In the big picture, what really is important in life? Is it that we become great academics or famous people or whatever? Or is it that we would become, by the grace of God, children of God? Because, of course, the eternal perspective means we have a hope where all our infirmities, all of our, whether mental or physical disabilities, will be healed, and we can be redeemed and restored to how God had planned us before the fall. God can overcome all of that. If you or someone you know has a weakness, a disability, whatever it is, look what we read from before in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 27. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. In God's sight, the weak, the disabled are just as precious, if not more so. He chose the weak to shame the strong. And yes, we're not saying that God does not care about the other creatures. Now, we mentioned it's human life in you shall not murder. It doesn't mean that God has no concern at all. Even the environment, Deuteronomy 20 verse 19, he says you're not to just go around chopping down trees for no reason. What about our animals? Have a look at this from Proverbs chapter 12 verse 10. A righteous man cares for the needs of his animal, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. I want you to look closely at that verse there, because that one verse was what influenced an Anglican clergyman, a minister in the Anglican Church in England, to start a organisation that's still running to this day called the RSPCA. In other words, a biblical principle that, yes, we are to care for our animals, though we don't do it with worship. We don't do it in a way that's not, that's idolatry. But we are told from the beginning that we're to keep the earth and care for it and so on. For the real point is that for all God's desire that we would not be cruel to animals, not kill them unnecessarily, and not be trampling on our environment. For all of that, for all of God's care for the environment and the animals of this world, all of them put together are not as precious as one little crying baby or one little baby that hasn't even yet been born. Because they're created in the image of God. And it's so important to God that, remember, after the 10 Commandments, we've had 4 commandments about how to love God. We've had the bridging commandment, the 5th commandment, teaching about human authority. And the rest are all about how we live with one another. And right at the top of that list, you shall not murder. The Bible says the law is written on our hearts. That's why, in principle, unbelievers go, yeah, of course you shouldn't kill people. Why? Survival of the fittest means, you might be better off. Why? Well, the Bible says the law is written on the heart. Have you ever noticed even a lot of unbelievers will wince at Professor Singer's idea? They can't quite put their finger on why it's wrong, but when he says you'd kill a newborn child in preference to an animal, something just doesn't sit right with most people. Why? The law is written on the heart. And what a contrast with Singer's view of let's get rid of, including the elderly, the people at the end of their lives. We've got to get rid of them, and the disabled and so on. What a contrast to the teaching of Jesus that stood out to seek out those in the rest of the society. Then even his disciples on occasions said, get away. Tell them to go away. But Jesus had compassion. Wasn't that a hallmark of his ministry? And who did he have compassion on so often? It was those who were disabled, those who had the leprosy, those who were crippled, and so on, all the different weaknesses and so on. There's a story of a medical professor who gave a case study to his students, his medical students, and he asked them for their opinion on whether to terminate a pregnancy in this particular case. And he said, in this case, the mother has tuberculosis and the father has syphilis. The mother has already had 4 children. One was born blind. Second died. The third one was deaf and unable to speak. And the fourth has tuberculosis. And he said, in this case, the mother is willing to have an abortion. If you advise her that way, what do you advise? And they all advised termination of the pregnancy. And the professor then says, well, congratulations, you've just murdered Beethoven. That was his situation. Now, again, I say, it's not because it's important lives are the famous ones, but to personalise the fact that we're talking about real people. Jesus' teaching said we should value the least of people in society, people's value and significance. And this is the important part, that people's value and significance is not reduced to whether they are physically or mentally or where they're up to. What about when the elderly lose either mind or physical capability? Have they no worth? Does a little baby in the womb have no worth if we don't want it? God's definition is everyone, even after I'm old and I've lost everything up here and you have to drag me out, I'm still made in the image of God. And so too with our elderly as we care for them. They may not have the capacity they had, but they're still precious in God's sight. They're still made in the image of God. Have you ever wondered what God's motive was when he told Joshua in the Old Testament to go in and wipe out the Canaanites? All of them. Don't spare anyone. What was God doing there? Well, if you track it through all the different occasions where God says why, this is why I drove out the nations before you. This is why you're not to be like those nations. They list. There's a list of particular sins. Because God said, don't go in and drive out the nations for 400 years, for generations. But when their sin had reached a particular level, God said, now, go in. What were the sins? Well, if you look at them, I won't start naming them to take a whole Bible study because there's many occasions in the Old Testament where it says what those sins were. And there were many and varied, but one that keeps recurring on that list that I think we can relate to is child sacrifice. They were killing their own children. And God says, go in and why that? They'd come to the point of murdering their own children. God's patience ran out. We're doing that in our society now at a greater rate than ever, in ways that were not even thought of only a matter of decades ago. Across the world. How did China manage to keep its one-child policy all those years? In the Western world, almost one in every four pregnancies are terminated. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How long will God's patience last? It ran out with Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, the sin had reached up to heaven. God says, that's it. Sodom and Gomorrah wiped out. God's patience ran out. And I just mentioned Canaan. What about the flood? God saw how wicked. It had reached a certain point. God's patience ran out. Judgment. Same thing in Canaan. I wonder how long before God's patience runs out now. You think God's not watching what we're doing? And doing particularly to our children? That was that one thing that kept coming up on that list of why the Canaanites were driven out. So prevalent in the abortion debate is the fact that a great number of women have suffered greatly. They've done studies that say, up to 6 months after, the women are coping pretty well. But longer term, there's a sense of grief and loss. There's a sense of pain. And the world's got no answer for that. The world's got no answer for that. How do you cope with that kind of loss and thinking? But we've got an answer. We've got an answer. Through Jesus, we have an answer that no one else has. And if you or anyone you know has gone through this whole thing, you need to have and be equipped with this answer. The answer is, there is forgiveness. And it's not some cheap forgiveness. It's God who knows what it's like to lose a child. God who gave up his one and only Son to go to that cross to wipe away all of our transgressions, all of our sin, all of the past, completely wiped clean, taken away through the love of the Son who went to that cross. And we can sympathize with those, and we can actually be part of the healing process for someone who's gone through that, to be able to not only tell them what true forgiveness is, that they can truly be forgiven, but also to be able to sympathize, because we know as we start digging further into this commandment in the coming weeks, we're going to find that even getting angry in a wrong way is the same commandment. We've all broken this commandment. We can stand with those who have gone through that pain and say, we've all broken this commandment. We can all find forgiveness and healing through what Jesus has done on the cross.